Ireland is dynamically pulled into a broader Atlantic world through the movement of people, goods, and ideas. And what had been a saltwater curtain that had more or less been separating the old world from the new world becomes a saltwater highway.
Welcome to Ireland and the Making of America,
a podcast exploring how Ireland and the Irish helped shape the United States, politically, culturally, socially, sometimes in ways that people rarely think about.
I'm Liam Kennedy. I'm the director of the Clinton Institute for American Studies at University College Dublin.
And I'm Scott Lucas, journalist and political analyst and professor of international politics at the Clinton Institute.
In this episode, we're joined by Patrick Griffin, professor of history at the University of Notre Dame in the United States. Patrick's work explores the intersection of colonial American and early modern Irish and British history. His books include The People with No Name, which is on Ireland's Ulster Scots and the British Atlantic world in the 18th century, and most recently his book, The Age of Atlantic Revolution, The Fall and Rise of a Connected World. In this episode, Patrick will help us explore the Irish experience, and especially the Ulster Scots experience in colonial America, and the role that Irish people played in the years leading up to the American Revolution.
We'll look at the complicated position of Irish migrants in the Atlantic world, as settlers, pioneers, participants in colonial expansion, and we'll unpack how Irish communities became deeply woven into the stories of America's founding, a story that echoes and resonates even today.
Hello, Patrick. Thank you for joining us.
I'm pleased to be here.
We've reached out to you, Patrick, because when we wanted to talk about 18th century America and Irish immigration and think about the Revolutionary War, you ticked all three boxes and we get you as one person. So that's a good deal. Thanks for joining us. But just before we get into the real importance of that period, could we start just a little bit further back and think about what kind of roles are the Irish having in this period of fervent colonial and empire rush that's going on in the Americas, in the Atlantic world, in the 17th and into the 18th century?
Well, in the 17th century, it's really not for the most part an Irish story. Now, there's connections between Irish and Ireland and colonial America ever since there was a colonial America. So you find some of the earliest settlers in Jamestown and in Virginia are going to be from Ireland. There's going to be a smattering up there in Puritan New England also that are going to come over. But for the most part in the 17th century, it's by and large an English story. And a lot of that has to do with, if you want to understand the role the Irish are going to play and how they're going to participate in this world, it's important to understand the fundamental dynamics that are kind of tying, if you will, the old world to the new world. And a lot of that had to do with kind of trade and movement, and much of that was for the most part centered on England. There was an Irish presence, an important Irish presence, particularly in the Caribbean in the 17th century, coming from places like Cork. So Kinsale was an important victualling center, and Cork City also for what was going on in the Caribbean. But for the most part, in the kind of the 13 colonies eventually, the Irish are not playing a big role until the 18th century. And a lot of that really has to do with kind of how Ireland is dynamically pulled into a broader Atlantic world through the movement of people, goods, and ideas. And what had been a saltwater curtain that had more or less been separating the old world from the new world becomes a saltwater highway. And as it does at that particular moment, then Ireland is immersed in that world. And then when that happens, then you find that migration really begins to kick off. But it's an 18th century phenomenon for the most part.
Okay, so let's get into that. At what point in the 18th century do we begin to see significant movement from Ireland, and from where in Ireland, and who from Ireland?
So in the 18th century, it really does begin to kick off and leases begin to expire. Leases that were largely signed at the time of the kind of the Williamite Wars of the Glorious Revolution. When that happens and when they begin to expire, the lease terms go up. And as they do, then people start looking for kind of escape routes. And so these escape routes are going to turn largely toward America. And a lot of this has to do, and America is going to be the chosen destination in particular, because, as I said before, the Irish are going to be immersed in this world, and that world is one of trade. And so linen is going to be an important commodity. And if you will, before the people are going to start migrating themselves, the goods they're producing with their hands, the linen, that craft good is what's going to tie this world together. And the people are necessarily just going to follow those kinds of patterns of movement, following the goods to a certain extent, and going where the ships are going. And the ships are going to places like the middle colonies. And so in Ireland, anyway, the place that's going to be immersed most fully into that world in the early part of the 18th century is going to be Ulster. So the northern part of Ireland is the one that's going to be bound more than any other place into this sort of world. And so the earliest movements, Ulster is really going to predominate early on for the most part. And it's going to be those people that are bound into the world are going to be the ones to decide to take the chance and then go to America. We often think that like old world and new world are two completely different places, but the reality of migration, certainly in the 18th century, is people begin to move to places they can imagine living in. So it's at first an active imagination. And as this part of Ireland is tied into the broader Atlantic, through particularly the trade in goods, the people start to imagine themselves in new places. And this kind of kicks off migration. It really begins in the late 17 teens. And if you will, the spark to that, or the particular occasion, is going to be those rising rents. And they decide, I'm going to go. Where am I going? Where are my goods going? Where are the ships going? That's where I'm going to head to.
Okay, so you say Ulster as a province, as a space, as a region, you say the people, but more particularly, who are these people? I mean, we need to get into religion here, right?
So the vast majority of them are going to be Presbyterian. That's beyond a shadow of a doubt. But I think a lot of the work that's been happening over the last couple of decades has shed light on the fact that this migration was probably more diverse than we had originally believed it to be. So it's not exclusively, although it's heavily a Presbyterian migration. You are going to have some people from the established church. You'll have numbers of Quakers that are also going to come over, and probably larger number of Roman Catholics than we had probably thought previously are also going to be making this journey. But it's those areas, the reason why Presbyterians are going to predominate, well, it does for a couple of reasons. First off, again, because of this process of Ireland's peculiar kind of immersion in the broader world, and the role of linen's going to play. Linen areas are going to be areas that are kind of heavily Presbyterian. That's going to be one thing. It also has to do with kind of colonial America is a place that is going to be, if you will, more welcoming to dissenting communities, but to Protestants in particular. And it's just because there are a few Catholics that are living in the colonies. And so as people begin to imagine themselves living over in various places in America, they can imagine being among co-religionists for the most part. And for Catholics, this may be, if you will, a bridge too far.
So these Presbyterians, predominantly, who are moving from that region, why do they want to move in such huge numbers? They're not experienced, presumably, the same degree of poverty of Catholics, but I suppose they're not exactly top of the tree either because of Anglicans. Is that part of the problem?
That is absolutely part of the problem. And so they're going to leave. The triggers are always going to be economic for the most part. So you look at certain spikes when people are going to be leaving over the course of the 18th century, has to do, as I mentioned before, with the leases that are going to expire. It also has to do 1740 and 1741 are going to be famine years. They're going to leave because of that. So they're going to leave when there were downturns in the linen market. That is going to be the particular trigger. But there's always, if you will, a deeper set of grievances that are also driving people over. And to a certain extent, Presbyterians, although they don't have it as bad as Catholics in Ireland at the time, certainly do indeed have this sort of like liminal space between Catholics and between established churchmen in Ireland, where they are effectively second-class citizens. And so they can't enjoy their full the full amount of civil rights that they would expect to enjoy, even though they believe that they were defenders of the kingdom against, like, for example, James II at the time of the Glorious Revolution. They still feel, if you will, that they are getting the short end of the stick. And so that is the deeper set of grievances that are setting them off. But it's always going to be the economic triggers, bang, that are going to get them moving.
So in moving, before we get to where they settle, what was the journey like for them?
So the journey usually actually wasn't all that bad in comparison. So for the most part, like in this late 17 teens, even in the early 1740s, you're going to find that the shipping between the north of Ireland and between the American colonies was absolutely predictable. And so it had to do particularly with the movement of linen and the movement of flaxseed coming back the other way. And so this is a dependable form of shipping. And for the most part, the people that are kind of crossing the oceans are experienced hands at doing so. so. And so because of that, they tend to be in good hands. The only time the system is sort of overwhelmed, and that's always when things get bad, whenever it comes to migration, is when you have huge numbers of people. And then you have, if you will, some rank amateurs that are kind of entering the fray to kind of make a few bucks for themselves. This is when things are going to get a little bit dodgy. So 1728, 1729, these are going to be years where a lot of people are going to be moving over, and it's going to overwhelm the ability of the shipping masters to kind of take care of that number that want to leave. And that's when things are going to get a little more difficult for them.
When they do arrive, Patrick, where are they settling into? There's a range of places they can move to. There's different forms of lifestyle they can take up, different forms of, of subsistence. What do they choose to do, or is it choice? Where do they end up and why?
Well, they're going to try a number of places at first. There's going to be a relatively large number of them are going to go to Puritan New England, thinking that as kind of among their fellow Calvinists, they would have a warm welcome. They don't enjoy a warm welcome. They are regarded as these Irish that are coming over who are going to drive us all to poverty. That's the way it is. So, and they are going to establish some settlements further afield in places in New England. For example, Londonderry, New Hampshire. There's a number of derries, Londonderries, places like that. So they carry the names, place names with them. There's going to be some that are going to be going to New York for the most part. There's some eventually that are going to go down south. I'll get to those folks in just a moment. But the vast majority of them are going to come to the middle colonies, but particularly to Philadelphia and to Newcastle in Delaware. That is almost like the Ellis Island of 18th century America. This is like the key entry point for many of them to enter into. Some then are going to go to Philadelphia, and you're going to find there's going to be an important Irish merchant community that's going to develop there, just like there will be an important Irish merchant community also developing in New York City. But the majority of them are going to head to kind of frontier regions. Now, frontier in our mind doesn't necessarily mean back country, meaning backward in a place you don't want to go to. Actually, in the 18th century, it's just the opposite. These are the places of opportunity. These are the places of growth. For people who want to get their hands on land, this is the place that you want to go to. This is where the future lies. And so, generally speaking, I think when it comes to migration, we tend to think that, but these people are going to marginal people going to marginal places. Actually, it's a people living on the margins in Ireland who are actually going to those places that are centrally important. And so areas where they're going to have access to land, that's what they want more than anything else. And so you're going to find that areas first in the back country in Pennsylvania, they're going to settle in places like Lancaster County, and you'll find a lot of Irish place names there, particularly from Ulster. And then eventually they're going to cross the Susquehanna River. They're going to head down into the Valley of Virginia. So over time, there's this progressive movement down what was called the Great Wagon Road. And this is going to be places just by down the Shenandoah Valley that are tied into a greater Philadelphia. So they're bound into that world. And as I mentioned before, these are people who are leaving when Ireland is immersed into a broader Atlantic. With their arrival in America, they help, if you will, reinforce that immersion by tying America more firmly into that world, also by the goods that they produce and the goods that they produce going out of Philadelphia.
One thing I had thought to ask you about the passage, and before we get more fully into settlement, I think it's an intriguing question because it might contrast with 19th century migration. What's the gender or sexual difference in makeup of those who are moving? How individual versus familial, etc.?
It changes with time. So early on, a lot of the migration, you're going to find that there's going to be a good amount of family migration. By 1740, 1741, because things are so dire at that point, particularly because of famine conditions, you'll find an uptick in the number of indentured servants. And when this is usually, if you will, unattached men and also unattached women are the sorts of people that are come over. The unions that they will by and large be created in the New World. So that's going to start tipping over the course of the 18th century. And as things become more dire, you're going to find that if everything, that's only going to be amplified.
Interesting. So back to the frontier settlement, and many thanks for your point that the frontier is maybe not what we imagine it to be. It's something else. It's something else. However, isn't it the case that many of those who were moving into the frontier were not always doing legally? Wasn't there a lot of squatting going on?
There was a lot of squatting, and a lot of that squatting had to do with the fact that there was a lot of kind of confusion over how lands were going to be allocated. And that differed from colony to colony. And sometimes they were invited to certain areas. Other places they were more or less allowed to squat, and then they would claim that they could claim the land because of improvements that they had made. When they first get to Pennsylvania, there's a big dispute with the Penn family, and with that dispute about kind of what the proprietor is able to do in terms of doling out lands. And when that is kind of caught up in the courts, many of the migrants are coming over at that particular period of time, and so they have no option, but if you will, to kind of settle on lands, even though no one really knows kind of whose lands ultimately they are. So they're going to go further and further out, and this is going to be, if you will, kind of a pattern that we're going to see developing in America, first in colonial America, then later on in the United States, where, if you will, settlers are going to go on land where kind of ownership is a question. And as they do so, that's how the bounds, if you will, of kind of like settlement are going to be pushed out.
So when you say ownership is a question, I suppose what we're not quite articulating then is the question of Native Americans and indigenous peoples.
Yes.
The settlement, if that's the right word, or at least the movement of those Ulster Scots into frontier areas, it does, if not exactly drive violence on the frontier, it presumably enhances it to some degree. And I'm just wondering what your reading of that is, because I think there are very different readings out there of this, and different mythologies indeed about frontier culture and violence. One, I think it has been purported, is that the British were maybe quite happy to see Ulster Scots settle into almost what you might call buffer zones against Native Americans.
Absolutely.
What do you make of that?
Well, it's a really complex but important question. There's no doubt about it that many of these early kind of projectors of settlement, and some of these are British, also some of these happen to be people who are kind of officials in colonial America, are saying we need to invite these people in because they can be hedges, and that's the term that's used over and over again, hedges against the Native Americans. And so you're going to find this is going to happen in Pennsylvania. This is going to be a reason that'll be used for their settlements in Virginia, and then down into the Carolinas even, that these people, as one person put it, a Pennsylvania official, these brave defenders of Derry and Enniskillen, aren't they going to be perfect as hedges against the Indians? But in fact of the matter, it's a little more complicated than that, because when they do settle, like particularly beginning in really the 17 teens into the 1720s, into the 1730s, it's a period on the frontier that's known as the Long Peace. There was actually an unprecedented period of peace among Native Americans and among kind of colonial American governments and the British, for the most part. And this is when you're going to find masses of them begin settling. And as they do so, it's not going to be settlement's not going to be defined by kind of outward hostility and outward conflict. That's going to change with time. That's going to change with time, particularly come to these moments of increased warfare and increased tension. So whereas you find in the 1730s and the 1740s, things are relatively peaceful when they're settling, even though they are kind of hedges against Native Americans. By the 1750s and 1760s, that calculus changes dramatically as you find that hostility is ramped up between various European powers, and also then necessarily between Native Americans who are living in some of these areas and between these imperial powers. And if you will, the Irish are going to find themselves caught between these various players. And so it's a fascinating sort of dynamic, and it ultimately is going to be cruel for Native Americans, that's for sure. But it's the irony is people who are coming from the margins are even going to be pushing off of land to people who are further marginalized.
Right. Yeah. So if we take that dynamic, as you say, which is very complex and which is very violent, and we move through the French and the Indian War toward the Revolutionary War, what kind of roles do the Ulster Scots take up as we move into that period?
Yeah, well, on the frontier, they play multiple roles. And again, this is where there's no kind of simple answers to anything. So you're going to find that people from Ireland in particular are going to play important roles in frontier regions as traders, as frontier diplomats. They're playing these roles for whatever reason. They are able to kind of to acculturate themselves to native cultures, some of them anyway, quite effectively. And some are famously going to be adopted by Native American groups as one of their own. But they often are doing so to kind of further their own interests and further their own gain. And sometimes they're doing so at the behest of colonial governments to further settlement. And so that's the flip side of that coin. Sometimes their ability to adapt and to adopt Native American ways is something that's going to endear them to some peoples, but at the same time is also going to underscore the kind of like subtle ways that they're going to be able to kind of get Native Americans off of land. And sometimes you're going to find it's going to be out and out hostility. So the 7 Years' War is going to touch off an extraordinarily challenging and bloody time for many of these areas, these settlers in frontier regions. They're living in exposed regions. And earlier on, they'd come to these exposed regions because this was a way for them to keep body and soul together. This was a way for them to gain land. Going out into risky areas, okay? But for a long period of time, they were able to live in peace. But when the 7 Years' War is touched off, that comes to an end. And you find report after report after report of frontier settlers who are being decimated by Native American raiding parties that are coming in. And so they find themselves in an impossible position at this particular point in time. And of course, eventually they're going to be repaying some of this brutality back in kind. And I think one of the nastiest kind of incidents of brutality against Native Americans is going to be perpetrated by a number of these settlers who themselves have been experiencing all kinds of violence on the frontier during the 7 Years' War. And that's going to be the Paxton Boys. And the Paxton Boys are really going to kind of articulate kind of a racist vision about how we have to just kind of extirpate these savages and kind of move them off the land so we can deal with these kinds of issues once and for all. And again, it's an irony that the people who are doing this are kind of just common settlers who are kind of finding themselves really kind of up against it because of their vulnerability living in exposed regions. And they would argue this is the only way that they can manage in these circumstances. But they are also going to perpetrate some of the worst violence against Native Americans in the colonial period. Indeed,
and that's absolutely worth taking time to underline. I mean, the Paxton Boys episode is famous. Unfortunately, it's not the only episode. It has been argued that that period does, to use your word, start to introduce a more overt racialization into the violence. Do you think that's true?
It absolutely is true. So whereas before you find that when people dealt with each other, they were dealing usually with kind of cultural ideas of difference, the idea that certain groups of people aren't as culturally advanced as others. And that sounds, of course, to our ears to be extraordinarily patronizing. But you see that these kinds of understandings of human difference start verging into more racialized understandings during periods of profound violence. And this is happening particularly during the 7 Years' War and as we get into the American Revolution. And for many in frontier regions, the American Revolution is just a continuation of what had happened in, if you will, the 20 years previous. And so it's just a continuation on of kind of living lives in these kind of living life in these vulnerable situations and exposed settlements now around a people that you increasingly have demonized because they too are in these kind of compromised positions as well.
Well, taking us then into the revolutionary period, and it's, of course, now this is this symbolic period for America 250, which is getting so much attention and which we'll keep coming back to in this episode. And we will really have to understand, I think, and maybe not everybody in this island of Ireland does understand just how important the roles of Ulster Scots were in the Continental Army, in the creation and signing of the Declaration of Independence. I know it's a big story, but what would you want to point to particularly there, Patrick, that underlines that importance?
I think that it's an importance that we've forgotten about, but I'm sure that we're going to get to in a little bit about kind of memory and things like that. But there's no doubt about it that the Irish are going to play important roles. And these roles are going to be at multiple levels. So famously, there's going to be a number of immigrants from Ireland who are going to be signing the Declaration of Independence. I think there's 3 that are born in Ireland, for the most part, are going to be signers. But it's going to be a larger number of people whose kind of parents and grandparents had migrated from Ireland and now who are also going to be signers of the Declaration of Independence. Most of them descended from people who have come from Ulster, but there's others, for example, from Dublin, Galway. There's going to be a Lynch that's going to be signing from South Carolina, from Galway. His grandfather had migrated over. There's going to be Charles Carroll of Carrollton is going to be the first Catholic, the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. He, of course, is going to come originally from an Irish family as well. So there's a lot of them that are going to be signing that. And there's going to be a lot of Irish are going to play real prominent roles in the American Revolution. And so Stephen Moylan is going to be Quartermaster General for George Washington. He's going to be the first person actually to use the term the United States of America before the Declaration of Independence. He will be the first person to use that term. You're going to find people like Hercules Mulligan. Isn't that a name? I love that name. Hercules Mulligan, who is a member of the Church of Ireland, was living in New York City, was a merchant and was a tailor, a haberdasher, and he became one of the most important spies at the time of the American Revolution. As New York is occupied by the British, he is spying and telling George Washington everything he'd ever want to know about troop movements, et cetera, et cetera. That's the role that Mulligan's going to play. And then you have Irish Americans like John Sullivan, whose forebears came from West Cork, and from Mad Anthony Wayne. Anthony Wayne is going to be another important general whose forebears also came from Cork. They're going to play important roles in the Continental Army. And so that's kind of a set story, and that's something that we knew about. I think what we are beginning to appreciate now is actually how many Irish are actually going to be in the Continental Army and serving in various militias. And those numbers are probably far larger than we had thought before. So there are some estimates that up to maybe quarter to a third of members of the Continental Army are going to be Irish or Irish American. That's a pretty big number. And some of these units are going to be really overrepresented by the Irish. So, for example, like the Pennsylvania Line at the time of the American Revolution was known as the Line of Ireland because there were so many Irish who were kind of serving in it. Don't get the idea either that this was just because they were doing it because of patriotic glory or something like that. That's not the case. The Continental Army was often like, if you will, the dregs of American society. And it's the people who really kind of couldn't afford to do anything else. And kind of the American Revolution disrupted all kinds of lives or gave them an opportunity to kind of run away from this indentured servants, et cetera, et cetera. These are the people who are going to be joining the Continental Army. But there's going to be lots who are going to be playing roles in militias, particularly in the Carolinas and South Carolina, where you're going to find that people who had just migrated from the north of Ireland to America, right in the wake of the 7 Years' War, they're going to be the ones who are really going to be attracted to joining the American cause. But if there is one rule when it comes to the Irish at the time of the American Revolution, say like the Scots, for example, the Irish were disproportionately on the Patriots' side. Whatever their particular religious persuasion is, they just were disproportionately on the Patriot side.
Just a quick question as a learning from you about all of this, and that is this a distinctly American story, the revolution for these Irish, or does it go back to Ireland? And by that I mean, as you are fighting for a cause to throw off British colonial control.
Sure.
Are there any of them that are looking back to Ireland and saying, well, we actually should be encouraging this back in the land that we came from?
That's going to happen in the wake of the American Revolution for the most part. There certainly is no question that many of them, particularly the most recent migrants, are going to see connections between Ireland's plight and between the plight of the American colonies. So just at the moment that they're leaving, when the crisis is beginning to amp up between America and between the British, that's going to ultimately lead to the beginnings, the first stirrings of the American Revolution. The Irish, too, are engaged in very much the same kind of conversation with the British, pushing back and saying, well, wait a minute, we have our rights as well. Wait a minute, we should have kind of more autonomy for our parliament as well. We should have more freedom. Some are even pressing for the idea potentially of independence, et cetera, et cetera. So they see themselves as kind of brothers in arms with the Americans in the 1760s and into the early 1770s. And so a lot of people are going to be leaving at that moment and feel that they had really gotten the shaft in Ireland and now they're getting the shaft again in America. So this is naturally something that they're going to want to do. But you don't find, if you will, that sort of like attempt to say, well, let's free Ireland now also. At the time of the American Revolution, that's going to be a post-revolutionary movement for the most part. But it's definitely going to be there, Scott. You're exactly right.
What about what's the motivation of the Ulster Scots to fight as patriots? And isn't it the case that they weren't all aligned with that? There's a little bit of tension. I mean, they weren't all feeling very friendly towards some of those elites who were signing up as patriot leaders, I imagine, especially not in the back country.
Completely. And so what you find is that, as I say, the Irish are disproportionately going to be patriot, that's for sure. But it's like When it comes to the American Revolution, not all politics, but most politics, as Tip O'Neill famously said, is local. And when it comes to them appreciating their plights and who they want to support, it very often kind of goes down to the particular issues that they're facing in their own communities. And in the Carolinas, particularly just before the revolution is touched off, there's going to be all kinds of issues that are swirling between settlers that are living out in frontier regions and between elites who are living further to the east. How do you protect them? How do you look at what kind of rights are they going to have? And so there's all sorts of simmering tensions, and in some cases violence that's going to break out because of it. And the revolution is going to occur just in the shadow of all of this that is going on. So in places like the Carolinas, for example, and this is the one area that, if you will, where you have true revolutionary Civil War violence. It's going to be in other areas as well, but this is the one area where it's really probably at its complete height. There's going to be so many Irish that are here, and they're dealing with, if you will, swirling allegiances, and they're often like moving from kind of team to team as this is going on, based upon kind of what their enemies are doing, what their local enemies are doing as well. And later on, it's all going to be gussied up kind of, with memory and nostalgia as they try to kind of fix what actually had happened. But early on in these kind of violent regions where people don't really have few options or anything like that, people are trying to figure out who their enemies are. And very often their enemies are their neighbors.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to take yet another step forward here into the post-independence period.
Right.
I mean, a period of turmoil in its own way. But within that, we see obviously the beginnings of a new political system. What role, again, it's the same question away, what role are the people from Ireland playing in that?
So the people from Ireland are going to play a big role. They're going to play the same sorts of roles that many other people in the American colonies and what then the new United States are going to play. And that is, for the first time, really in the history of America, common people are going to become actors. And so they're going to start to take on kind of roles that they before had been unaccustomed to, but they're going to embrace with a great deal of enthusiasm. Just, if you will, the revolution, however frightening, terrifying it was, however much uncertainty it caused, is going to be an empowering period for a lot of common people because they are playing these new roles in many ways for the first time. Many of them had borne arms against the British. And so this is going to be sort of a mark of their sacrifice, and also is going to be something that's going to allow them to kind of legitimize kind of the roles that they're going to play in the new United States. And they're going to be no different for the most part than anybody else. The difference is, and this gets back to Scott's question, the difference is going to be, there's going to be a set of, if you will, radical emigres who are going to be coming over from Ireland, who are also, if you will, going to catalyze American politics in lots of ways. Now, these are the people who are going to push for, well, the American Revolution must realize everything that it was kind of set out to try to achieve. And that's what we're going to do in American politics. They will unapologetically throw themselves into American politics, supporting Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson's party, of trying to expand, if you will, the notion of rights, particularly for common people. But they see that doing so is also going to potentially serve the cause of Ireland. And so they're going to see these two as necessarily yoked and connected. So if you will, if the tree of liberty is first planted in America and is beginning to flower, what can it then do in Ireland? And so it's this, if you will, euphoric moment when people think that politics can actually be changed, that people can play a role in politics. And you're going to find a lot of these emigres that come over are going to be the ones that are going to be, imagine, if you will, this moment of liberty now that is going to span the Atlantic.
So within that, I know that this again is a very complex area, and we're asking you to very quickly, tell us about these huge swathes of history with so many different allegiances, swirling allegiances, as you say. But can you help us work out, which I think is a particularly complex thing, how we pattern the Irish, Ulster Scots, Catholic Irish, vis-a-vis the various political schisms of that period, where we have Federalist, we have Democratic, Republican, but before long we have Democratic and Republican, a new Republican Party. Where do the Irish allegiances kind of move in that sort of very dynamic and chaotic politics at that time?
Yeah, and so the Irish are going, as I say before, the one virtue that they have, most of them happen to be Protestant, is very easy, if you will, to somehow become American in the years after the American Revolution. And so they are going to throw themselves, as I say, into politics, but they're also going to break down in ways that Americans are breaking down politically as well. Most of the Irish are going to be supporters at first of the Democratic Republican Party. All right. And later on, that's going to change, particularly as some are doing well. In other words, you're going to find a number of Irish are going to become first what we call Whigs. And Whigs are going to be, if you will, the precursors to the modern Republican Party. And so there's going to be a breakdown largely, if you will, kind of along class lines. And these class lines are then, if you will, going to, if you will, put a wedge within the Irish community of different people conceiving of themselves in fundamentally different kinds of ways. The people who are on the upper half are the people who are going to increasingly consider themselves to be American. And these are the people that are going to adopt, if you will, kind of the identity of being Scotch-Irish. Increasingly, the people that tend to be more like the bottom as time goes on, more and more of them Catholic, they are going to just kind of embrace the moniker Irish for the most part in America. And when it comes to the Irish in America early on, the vast majority of them are definitely going to be members of the Democratic Republican Party, what will be the Democratic Party.
Right, right. Interesting. And you mentioned there that term Scots-Irish now. We've moved away from Ulster Scots to Scots-Irish, and it's coming into play at this point in time. And we'll come back to ask some questions about what it might mean today toward the end of this episode. But taking us into this this post-war period, the one word that hasn't been mentioned in these allegiances and splits is the word slavery. Because that also, of course, now has a very significant role to play in terms of how those parties develop, but also in how we move into another major period of conflict. And you know what I'm going to ask you? Where do the Irish fall into all of this?
So the Irish, those who are going to be members who are going to be aligned with the Democratic Party for the most part, as we get into the 19th century especially, some of them will certainly be pro-slavery, but a lot of them are going to be, if not ambivalent about slavery, just saying that this is not really going to be our cause. And some of that has to do with kind of the strange alignments of the Democratic Party. Some of it has to do with kind of the rise of abolitionism. And abolitionists, particularly in the North, even though they would want to fight for the cause of African Americans, are also not going to be very pro-Catholic. And are also going to look down their noses at Catholic Irish. And so it's very difficult for the Irish to, if you will, to kind of consider themselves to be in league with abolitionism, largely because of this. They see many of the abolitionists also as their enemies. It's also true, of course, in certain areas, particularly in cities, as more and more Irish Catholics are coming over, they're going to see African Americans as competitors for jobs, but there's a famous sort of like book of how the Irish came white. And the fact of the matter is the Irish were always white in America. There was never any question about that whatsoever. But they are certainly going to be competing with African Americans. And we know that they are going to be able to treat African Americans in horrible, horrible ways. In many ways, it's a lot like kind of the dynamic that we talked about with the Paxton Boys, is that people who are coming from the margins are also going to find themselves in conflict with people who are also in marginal situations in a new country. And America and the Irish are going to be able to fit themselves into America's racial calculus very, very easily. And there's not going to be kind of much compunction or much problem about that, certainly in the early part of the 19th century.
Okay, and that racial calculus is something we'll return to in another episode in more details. Thank you. Before we leave the 19th century with another great leap, we're on the cusp of civil war. You talked about how the Irish might map onto the Revolutionary War. How do they map onto the Civil War?
Okay, so they map on in very complicated ways, so there's going to be large numbers of Irish who are going, I wouldn't say large, not by kind of northern standards, but relatively speaking, large numbers of Irish that are going to be living in important southern cities, particularly in port towns. So you're going to find in Savannah, in Charleston, and particularly in New Orleans, you're going to find lots of Irish going to be living in these places. And the Irish, once the Civil War breaks out, are going to join the Confederate cause. There's no, and as a matter of fact, they will be disproportionately represented in that Confederate cause. And lots of them are going to fight. And I think there were like 13 Irish units or something like that were formed. No, probably more than that were formed at the time of the Civil War in the South. So many of them are fighting in the South, but many, many more are going to fight for the Union cause. And they're going to fight for the Union cause just because there happen to be so many Irish at that time who are living in northern cities, places especially like New York, like Philadelphia, like Boston. They're living in these urban centers, and so the Irish are going to join in large numbers. Now, there's going to be the Irish Brigade. This is Thomas Francis Meagher's unit that is also, getting back to Scott's question, is intent, if you will, on not only fighting for the Union cause, but fighting for the Union cause because that's so central to the Irish question. If the Union fails, Irish freedom, according to Meagher and some others, was going to be an impossibility. So the Irish had to fight for this cause. And so the Irish find themselves there, if you will, kind of caught up in the idea of union as much as Americans in the North are caught up in the idea of union. But the Irish are going to, if they're playing disproportionately large numbers are going to be kind of serving in the South. In the North, it's going to be relatively small in comparison to the numbers. And that's because a lot of Irish are really ambivalent about the Civil War early on. A lot of that ambivalence stems from the fact that I just talked about. Is they going to be fighting for abolitionists? Why would they want to fight for abolitionists who happen to be their enemy? And certainly as the war tilts one from union toward more of freedom, as the war progresses, the Irish are going to be more and more ambivalent about kind of fighting for the cause. They also see themselves as being the cannon fodder. Why should we go out and sacrifice ourselves? And so, although many, many more Irish are going to serve in integrated units, that is, units that are not wholly Irish, than they will, say, in the Irish, almost exclusively Irish Brigade, there's not as many Irish serving as at a percentage of their numbers as you're going to find serving in the South, largely because of this ambivalence.
Fascinating. I wish we could spend more time in that, but I think that in the interest of time, we're going to have to spin forward really into today. But to maybe pick up the question of memory that you posed in passing, Patrick, I'm struck if you look at the last major national census in the United States in 2020, and of course one has to take these a little bit with a pinch of salt, but nonetheless, they're very intriguing. You get about 32 million people, I think, are ticking an Irish heritage box. I think the Scots-Irish heritage box is only about 2.8 million. Now, relatively, that's a very small number. What happened to them?
They just mixed and merged into the broader whole. That's the answer to it. So you would expect a lot of them. And a lot of that has to do with kind of like memory is a funny thing and how it works. So Scotch-Irish identity was really important in the 19th century as a way of distancing people to distance themselves from all the incoming Irish Catholics that are flooding into American cities, particularly in the years before the famine and then accelerating with the famine and then after the famine, all the way to 1925. And I think, though, that a lot of that identity is kind of attenuated over time as then people just consider themselves to be American. So people who are living in so many places in the United States, of course, would technically be Scotch-Irish when it came to their ethnicity. It really doesn't have much purchase and matter as much as it is to the Irish. The Irish are going to, if you will, hold on to that identity more fully, by and large, because of the kind of sometimes difficult, challenging reception they receive when they come over to the United States of America. Being at that point an alien people or regarded as an alien people, being Catholic, being somehow different, holding on to that Irish identity as a way for them to, if you will, to distinguish themselves in this kind of mosaic that is America. And then it's going to be something that they're going to hold on to as almost kind of a point of pride from that point forward. And so I think Irish identity has a little more stickiness to it, if you will, than kind of Scotch-Irish identity in the American context.
So where would you today look for what remains of Scots-Irish identity or Scots-Irish culture? One hears that there maybe are certain communities, if that's not too large a word, in the Appalachians in certain areas. There's a residue perhaps in popular culture, folkways, food, language. How much do you make of all of that? What remains?
Well, it's all over the place. So if you went to like the state of Texas, you're going to find a lot of people, for example, who would have Scotch-Irish forebears, but that's so many generations removed. You could look at things like country music itself, right? Has so many sort of antecedents to that kind of culture and that came over. So bluegrass. So you can find it in the music, you can find it in the culture, you could find it in the names of the people themselves. There's no two ways about it. But to the most part, those things have become, as I say, completely attenuated. But those people would have more or less kind of followed, if you will, the course of American empire further to the west. And so that earliest kind of settlement pattern that we're seeing in down from Pennsylvania down into the Shenandoah Valley, then the backcountry of the Carolinas, will the next generation become the settlement patterns going to places like Kentucky and Tennessee. And then next generation are going to be these places going off to Texas. And then after that, it's going to be going further west to places like California. So you're going to find this kind of one generation after another, but with each generation, if you will, it becomes attenuated as this kind of flow of people becomes just really becomes no different than the broader flow of so many other Americans to various places. And the Scots-Irish just become American.
As we're moving toward the end here, I want to pick up memory again, because in this year of America 250, memory is important, or call it commemoration. And of course, commemoration really means reflecting on, what are the key stories of the nation. And, in your country right now, American history, I think, has become a little bit of a partisan battleground. Can I say that? That's probably true to some degree.
You can.
So within that, how do we look back at some of these myths of the Scots-Irish, in particular, the Ulster Scots? Let me give an example of what I mean. I think that frontier mythology has been sort of picked up in a very positive way, perhaps not surprisingly, in the last year, because it fits into a certain reading of that period, which has to do with the rugged individualism of these people, which becomes primary for a later American identity, and Jeffersonianism and so on. I think it's true that there are people in Northern Ireland today that look at that and are, thinking, good thoughts about their ancestors in relationship to 250, and they should. But as you yourself pointed out, these are also people who, for whatever reason, end up in a viciously violent relationship to Native Americans. So which of these mythologies do we take forward, the rugged pioneers or the Indian killers?
Wow. That's a tough question. If I could opt for sort of like a third, to be quite honest with you, instead of going down one of those, because the answer to your question, of course, is yes. In many ways, all of this complicated past is part of America's complicated story, and that goes into it. Myths are always made of some parts of these stories, but myth is the sort of thing that makes us focus on certain aspects, but it occludes others. I think there is, getting back to your point about the polarization of America right now, there is a tendency among Americans to see themselves as an exceptional people. For some, either exceptionally good or exceptionally bad. And I think we're seeing that kind of in the United States right now at this particular moment. And I would urge us to kind of think and move beyond this sort of like typically polarizing way of thinking about things. It was both. And so what then kind of lesson can we learn from the Irish at the time of the American Revolution? Well, just starting on, as I said before, it's a complicated story because the American Revolution was a complicated moment. And with that in mind, I think it leads us to kind of move beyond the myth to see some of the realities. And the realities is that America's composition has always been, if you will, sort of a mosaic. And I think the Irish have been an important part of that mosaic. Not the only part, not the most significant part, but certainly an important part of that mosaic. And just as we've gone back and we've tried to kind of understand that the Irish probably had larger roles to play in the American Revolution than we had previously thought. And a lot of that had to do with kind of how memory works and how some people are erased from memory and some people are kind of highlighted in memory. It also allows us to see that this kind of very complicated affair was really kind of composed of complicated people, and the Irish were yet another part of that story. And so that's a myth, I think, that is really kind of, if you will, holding on to, is that, if anything, the American Revolution was a much more inclusive story than we had probably previously believed. And necessarily, it means that you're dealing with kind of complex realities. But then again, people are complex. And I think that we deserve, if you will, a myth that kind of reflects those realities more effectively.
That's all for this episode of Ireland and the Making of America.
Thanks to Patrick Griffin for joining and sharing his insights on the Irish experience, and especially the Ulster Scots experience in Revolutionary era America.
You can follow this series on all your favorite podcast platforms: Spotify, Apple, YouTube. And you can follow us on social media, the Clinton Institute, Scott Lucas Worldview, or Liam Kennedy's pages.
And if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, share, leave a review.
We'll be back next week with another conversation on Ireland and the making of America.
Until next time, this podcast was brought to you by the Clinton Institute, UCD, and produced, with thanks, by Michelle May.